to why it collapsed. And NIST, like the 9/11 Commission, evidently does not want you asking why Building 7 collapsed, even though it was not hit by a plane. On its website, it says that one of its objectives is to determine why and how World Trade Center buildings 1, 2, and 7 collapsed after the initial impact of the aircraft, thereby implying that Building 7, like the Twin Towers, was also hit by a plane. In any case, a third problem with the official account of the collapses of these three buildings is that all prior and subsequent collapses, total collapses of steel frame high-rises, have been caused by explosives in the procedure known as controlled demolition. This problem is made even more severe by the fact that the collapses of these three buildings manifested many features of the most difficult type of controlled demolition known as implosion. I will mention 7 such features. First, the collapses began suddenly. Steel, if weakened by fire, would gradually begin to sag. But as one can see from the videos available on the web, all three buildings are completely motionless up to the moment they begin to collapse. Second, if these huge buildings had toppled over, they would have caused enormous death and destruction in lower Manhattan. But they came straight down. This straight down collapse is the whole point of controlled implosion, which only a few companies in the world are qualified to pull off. Third, these buildings collapsed at virtually free fall speed, which means that the lower floors, with all their steel and concrete, were offering virtually no resistance. Fourth, as mentioned earlier, these collapses were total collapses, resulting in piles of rubble only a few stories high. This means that the enormous steel columns in the core of each building had to be broken into rather short segments, which is what explosives do. Fifth, great quantities of molten steel were produced, which means that the steel had been heated up to several thousand degrees. And witnesses during the cleanup reported that sometimes when a piece of steel was lifted out of the rubble, it was dripping, molten. Sixth, according to many firefighters, medical workers, journalists, and World Trade Center employees, many explosions went off both before and during the collapses. For example, Fire Captain Dennis Tardillo, speaking of the South Tower, said, "I hear an explosion and I look up. It is as if the building is being imploded from the top floor down, one after another. Boom, boom, boom." Firefighter Richard Minisinski said, "It seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings. It seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions." Thanks to the release in August of 2005 of the oral histories recorded by the Fire Department of New York shortly after 9/11, dozens of testimony of this type are now available. I've published an essay on them, which is included in a forthcoming book on 9/11 and Christian faith, along with a lecture on the destruction of the World Trade Center, which I am now summarizing. A seventh feature of controlled implosions is the production of large quantities of dust. In the case of the Twin Towers, virtually everything except the steel, all the concrete, the desks, the computers, was pulverized into very tiny dust particles. The official story cannot explain one, let alone all 7 of these features, at least, as Hoffman and Jones point out, without violating several basic laws of physics. But the controlled demolition theory easily explains all these features. These findings are inconsistent with the idea that al-Qaeda terrorists were responsible. Foreign terrorists could not have gotten access to those buildings for all the hours it would have taken to plant the explosives. Also, al-Qaeda terrorists probably would not have had the courtesy to make sure that the buildings came straight down rather than toppling over. Terrorists working for the Bush-Cheney administration, by contrast, could have gotten such access. Given, you're ahead of me here. They could have gotten such access, especially given the fact that Marvin Bush and Wirt Walker III, the president's brother and cousin respectively, were principals of the company in charge of security for the World Trade Center. Another relevant fact is that the evidence was destroyed. An examination of the building's steel beams and columns could have shown whether explosives had been used to slice them, but virtually all of the steel was removed before it could be properly investigated, then put on ships to Asia to be melted down. It is usually a federal offense to remove anything from a crime scene, even a matchbook, but here the removal of over 100 tons of steel, the biggest destruction of evidence in history, was carried out under the supervision of federal officials. Evidence was also apparently planted. The passport of one of the hijackers on Flight 11 was allegedly found in the rubble. Having survived the fiery infernal, I'm not making this up. The passport had survived not only the fiery inferno caused by the airplane, but also whatever caused everything else in these buildings to be pulverized into tiny dust. The magic passport. To sum up, the idea that U.S. officials have given a satisfactory or even close to satisfactory explanation of the collapse of the World Trade Center is a myth. And these officials have implicitly admitted this by refusing to engage in rational debate about it. Michael Newman, a spokesman for NIST, reportedly said during a recent interview that none of the NIST scientists would participate in any public debate with scientists who reject their report. When Newman was asked why NIST would avoid public debate if it had confidence in its report, he replied, "Because there is no winning in such debates." In the same interview, Newman had compared people who reject the government's account of the collapses with people who believe in Bigfoot and a flat earth. And yet he fears that his scientists would not be able to show up these fools in a public debate. In any case, I come now to the final myth, which is myth number 9. There is no doubt that Flight 77, under the control of al-Qaeda hijacker Hani Hanjour, struck the Pentagon. There are, in fact, many reasons to doubt this claim. We have, in the first place, reasons to doubt that the aircraft that hit the Pentagon was under the control of Hani Hanjour. For one thing, the aircraft, before striking the Pentagon, reportedly executed a 270-degree downward spiral, and yet Hani Hanjour was known as a terrible pilot who could not safely fly even a small plane. Russ Wittenberg, who flew large commercial airliners for 35 years after serving in Vietnam as a fighter pilot, says that it would have been totally impossible for an amateur who couldn't even fly a Cessna to maneuver the jetliner in such a highly professional manner. Moreover, as a result of that very difficult maneuver, the Pentagon's West Wing was struck, but terrorists brilliant enough to get through the U.S. military's defense system would have known that this was the worst place to strike for several reasons. The West Wing had been reinforced, so the damage was less severe than a strike anywhere else would have been. This wing was still being renovated, so relatively few people were there. A strike anywhere else would have killed thousands rather than 125. And the Secretary of Defense and all the top brass, whom terrorists would presumably have wanted to kill, were in the East Wing. Why would an al-Qaeda pilot have executed a very difficult maneuver to hit the West Wing when he could have simply crashed into the roof of the East Wing? A second major problem with the official story. There are reasons to believe that the Pentagon was struck only because officials at the Pentagon wanted it to be struck. For one thing, Flight 77 allegedly, after making a U-turn in the Midwest, flew back to Washington undetected for 40 minutes. And yet the U.S. military, which by then clearly would have known that hijacked airliners were being used as weapons, has the best radar systems in the world, one of which, it brags, does not miss anything occurring in North American airspace. The idea that a large airliner could have slipped through is absurd. Also, the Pentagon is surely the best defended building on the planet. It is not only within the P-56A restricted airspace that extends 17 miles in all directions from the Washington Monument, but also within the P-56B airspace the 3-mile ultra-restricted zone above the White House, the Capitol, and the Pentagon. The Pentagon is only